So if you've been on the Christian side of the internet recently, you've seen something of a conflict between the Oriental Orthodox and the Eastern self-proclaimed Orthodox. Now, before we get into the differences and issues here, I want to give you the setting for this debate. Often, modern popular Eastern Orthodox apologetics will present what is called a negative position, or for example, a view that attacks all others but does not give a positive proof or a convincing proof to its own. For example, they would attack Catholics for innovating over time from the Great 1054 Schism, or Oriental Orthodox for being, well, wrong on something, but will never show you why you should be Eastern Orthodox. Why is this important? Because you actually haven't seen what they really believe. Because this is a message to all those comments I know I will eventually get. Pray for unity. This isn't important. We should be fighting the real problem, not each other. And to these commenters, I want to propose something. Consider those who made Christ into a created being, like Arius. Why are there never calls for unification with Arians, with those who split Christ's garment and split him and his life-giving salvation from the church, as was said by St. Peter, the seal of the martyrs, who rejected him even before death? Because if there are even the most pious and holy Arians who claim to love and serve God to death, if they are right about anything regarding Christ, then the sacraments, the church, even the worship of God, it becomes just a new form of paganism. Dear viewers, I ask you to pay attention very carefully and compare the opposing sides' views with the Arians, an easy figure to oppose. What is the logical consequence of these beliefs? Not just what they say they believe in. Do they make Christ a man? Do they split up the Trinity? Do they aspire to become literally God himself? Time to make it
Orthodox.
now, I want to introduce some of the key differences between Oriental Orthodoxy, which include the Coptic, Syriac, Armenian, Indian Orthodox churches, for example, and the Chalcedonians, like the Byzantine and Roman churches. And wouldn't you know it, our good friend Kyle has volunteered to help us with this.
They call themselves Christian, Catholic, Protestant, Evangelical, believe the two natures. This is called diophysitism. Now, the Orientals believe what is called miaphysitism. They believe that Christ is a divine person who has a one divine human nature.
Now, while there are some similarities in how we conduct our liturgies and the basics of icon veneration, like Kyle implies, the one thing that separates the Oriental Orthodox from the rest is the belief in the one nature of Christ. And I want to break this down as much as possible because a lot of this discussion can get vague. And at its core, it is not really that difficult, simple even. Now, while the Protestants, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and historians, etc., believe that after the union, or at the point when Christ took flesh from St. Mary, Christ is in two natures, God and man separate. The Oriental Orthodox are the only ones who kept the Orthodox doctrine. That is, Christ is one at the point of incarnation, or has one nature, the God man. Now, what does nature and all of this mean? Well, it's early Aristotelian philosophy that speaks on the matter, and the fathers who utilized this philosophy to explain theology lay it out clearly. For example, we have Aristotle himself talking about how ousia is a generality, right? It's not the individual man, the single unit of a man, or the individual horse, right? It's a collection of all man, a collection of all animal. And even those who would commentate on Aristotle, like Porphyry, would say similar, this is what he meant. You have the individuals, like the individual person, like Socrates or Plato, and the secondary substance, also known as the general, the collection of all individual substances or individuals. Again, echoed by all the fathers. You have St. Basil the Great making the distinction between essence, the generality, and hypostasis, the individual, is the same between the general and the particular. And the persons, every person, so for example, when we complete and we give this individual a name, like Paul, for example, he is now a person. And even St. Cyril, he makes it to say that each person, each of these individual persons have their individual existence. And this is how they gain their identity. So in summary, before I lose you here, nature can either mean a essence in general, the collection of all men, horses, whatever. Hypostasis can mean a concrete or individualized individual, like, for example, the man, the individual Paul. While person, usually as was used by the fathers and St. Paul in his letters, means a mask, appearance, or self-subsistent hypostasis, otherwise known as an individual that has its own or gains its own existence by itself. So right away, the question is not simply whether Christ is in two natures after the incarnation, but what is being counted as two? Are the two natures common essences or concrete particulars? If they are common essences, then the formula becomes a union of universals, divinity in general and humanity in general. But the incarnation is not the union of divine essence as such with human essence as such. It is the one hypostasis or the one individual of the Word, assuming particular individual flesh from the Virgin Mary. Since the divine essence is common to the whole Trinity and the human essence is common to the entire human race, treating the two natures as these commonalities, as these groupings, makes the entire union incoherent. We would have certain cases where, for example, we have the entire human essence tying on the cross as Jesus did for our sins. But the other option, if we have two natures after the union and they're both concrete individual particulars, then the two natures means two concrete realities, which risks turning God, Jesus Christ, individual man, joined to the Word rather than the one individual Word himself. You have the two individuals existing simultaneously, and you would have two things making Christ a particular man cooperating with the Word. In recent Eastern Orthodox apologetics, this is sometimes rephrased by saying that the human nature is inserted into the personal existence of the Word. So now the Son possesses human properties and becomes composite. But this does not get rid of the problem, it just relocates it. If the humanity just becomes another part of the Word considered in himself, then the Word becomes a whole composed of parts. It makes God into a creature. If it is part of the divine essence, even God himself becomes composite. If it is only related or conjoined to the Word, the union is not a real union, substantial, but merely by relation. For example, you would have to say that St. Mary was only the mother of God by relation. The only way to say humanity is part of anything is that it is part of the composite hypostasis of Christ, the composite individual of Christ as one reality. Now, we believe that Christ is one individual nature of the God-man who is both created and uncreated from the point of conception. But how can he be these two things at once? As our saints say, take the individual human nature. It is both material and immaterial, yet one human. For example, take the one common Coptic guy, for example, one individual Mina. I wouldn't say that his mom only gave birth to Mina's body while his soul came from wherever else it did. I would say that she gave birth to the one unified individual of Mina, who is both body and soul in different respects. And this seems obvious, right? But this is the crux of the issue. Calling the hypostasis created and uncreated does not mean there's two things, so there has to be two individuals, one for each thing that we attribute to, but rather that the humanity gains its subsistence, its existence from the Word.
In church history, there was an Nestorian crisis where an archbishop of Constantinople basically came up with this term of Christotokos. He didn't want to call Mary the God bearer, he wanted to call her the Christ bearer. His concern was saying God was born sounded wrong or misleading.
Mary is only the mother of Christ. You divide Christ himself, Nestorius. The Word took flesh, one person, fully God, fully man. Therefore, Mary is truly the mother of God.
But as Orthodox, we can't say she is a Theotokos. This is a heresy. Nestorianism is a major heresy, and St. Cyril stood up for Orthodoxy against Nestorius. Truly, God suffered. That the one who suffered on the cross is not just the human Jesus, but it is the one person Jesus.
Nestorius, most hated and slandered. And to a certain point, there's a lot of misunderstanding around why exactly. And before the clips come in, let me give the background behind this. Nestorius was the patriarch of Constantinople who did deny saying Theotokos, but only by itself. He said he preferred to say Theotokos and Christotokos to be more accurate. But the reason why is because he believed in two natures in one person, in multiple of his writings. And the reason why he hated Cyril, because he taught one nature. He even claimed that Cyril's idea of one nature and one Christ led him to making Mary the mother of divinity. And he said two natures to be more safe. Where have I heard that before? And if you weren't convinced already, he loved the Chalcedonians, especially Leo and Flavian. When he read their letters and formulas, he was all but ready to adopt them.
What happens is other heresies arise, like this one heretic who said that
one nature only after the incarnation. The humanity dissolved like wax in the divine fire. Deform the mystery. Christ is one person in two natures, unmixed.
Basically, Christ's humanity is effectively absorbed into his divinity. One nature. Problem with the Oriental formulation is they say, oh, we're miaphysites, not monophysites. But their formula can sound very close to the error and lacks the Chalcedonian careful precision. Two natures is essential because if Christ is not fully human, humanity is not healed. If he's not fully divine, salvation is impossible. So by saying that Christ has two natures, we're protecting both truths simultaneously. And it's clarifying what St. Cyril was teaching before, is because that's what the Orientals will go to, is, oh, St. Cyril, who is this hero against Nestorianism, he taught one nature, and he actually doesn't.
Now, if you ever want to read real drama, I would recommend that you read the Acts of Chalcedon. Not only does Dioscorus say that if Eutychus says one divine nature, I anathematize him, and to this day, they still associate us with the heresy. Eutychus himself, after agreeing that Christ is doubly co-substantial, when he starts telling the Chalcedonian hero Flavian that Christ is one nature, just like St. Athanasius and Cyril did, he starts crashing out and trying to force him to say two natures after the union, instead like Nestorius. In total, the council itself is a giant mess. Leo contradicts Cyril pretty much with every breath, let's say, and doesn't say from two natures, as Cyril did, once in a positive light. Chalcedon readmits Theodoret and Abbas, both known historians of which hated, and I mean hated, Cyril. Why did they do this, you may ask? They say that Nestorius bad, and Theodoret says, okay, I was always right, but Nestorius bad. Yeah, so Nestorius himself even said Nestorius bad, and that's not how we retract heresy, just by condemning a person, which is a crazy sort of confession. I couldn't imagine it doing it myself, but rather it requires a total retraction of the heresy itself, especially since Theodoret was a known liar according to Cyril. Yeah, and by the way, Kyle, just like we mentioned earlier, your saints condemn saying from two or of two natures. So yeah, there goes clarifying Saint Cyril.
The will is proper to nature, as we see Christ's two wills in the Bible. Because
by the way, speaking of the Bible, mia physis is also biblical, as the Bible clearly describes through the strongest form of union, of marriage, not only of man and woman, but Christ his church, as something so strong, is of a union that cannot be separated into two by any means of man in reality. And it honestly doesn't get much more defined. The two become so inseparably united that they are now one, united in reality. Otherwise, you risk splitting Christ from his church. And you see this again in Mark 10:8, Philippians 2:7, John 1:14. And when you see these verses in the Bible, the most prominent ones will be Mark 10:8, in which Jesus quotes Genesis and defines union as the coming from two, of two, into one. And after that, they are no longer two, but one flesh. And again, in all of the Bible, this is a continual theme. And even in Paul's letters, in 1 Corinthians 8:6, he clearly defines God as one after the union. And we cannot separate them by our own lack of comprehension. So it doesn't just take, I see two things, therefore there are two. Now, Kyle claims that wills are proper to nature and that it's biblical.
He was fully man. In John 6, for I have come down to heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. There are so many verses in the Bible that make it clear that there is two wills in Christ, because he is fully God, fully man.
So if we had any fathers that explain these verses. Very easy one is St. James, who condemned those opposing ways of thought. In James 1:18, very simply says, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways, which is destructive for those like Erhan who claim that.
Bogboy says, does David believe Christ has two minds?
He has a divine mind and he has a human mind, and he makes use of both.
Or, for example, St. Gregory the theologian, who literally states that when Christ says that I do not come down to do my will but your will, he's speaking from the lens that there is no will but yours, as we share one will as God and Trinity. Not from the language of the nature that is assumed, as if there are two centers and two natures that are agreeing with each other or fighting against each other. And you even find this in St. John Chrysostom, who echoes the same language. Still not convinced? Let's break it down logically. If will is numbered according to nature, and the faculty of willing is proper to the commonality or the common essence, then both the Trinity and humanity each would have numerically one will, which obviously doesn't make sense, as all humans don't all have this one will and would make both unities the same, which would make us polytheists. If will is counted by person, so the whole, natures don't act, persons do, then the Trinity would have three wills for each person, just as humanity has many wills for each person, making the divine persons three centers of willing and reducing the unity of God's will to mere agreement or cooperation, which leads to three gods, and again, polytheism. So what we have left here is that will must be counted by numerical unity of being. God has one will because the divine being himself is numerically one, simple, and undivided. Human beings have many wills because human nature exists only in many individuals or hypostasis, even though conceptually it is one in generality or commonality.
And this is why we need the Council of Chalcedon, and this is why the Orientals need to accept it, because it provides a clear definition of these, that the same Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, the same perfect in Godhead, also perfect in manhood, truly God and truly man, to be acknowledged in two natures, unconfusedly, unchangeably, undivisibly, inseparably. And Chalcedon is relying on Cyril's writings. It canonized as authoritative two of Cyril's of Alexandria's letters in the Tome of Leo, written against the Monophysites. And so at the Fourth Ecumenical Council, there's a debate about what did Ephesus and St. Cyril really mean in his letters refuting Nestorianism. Chalcedon is consistent with St. Cyril's Christology. His central point is that Christ's unity is that he has a single hypostasis, and that Christ is composed out of two natures, that Christ has two wills, and all actions of Christ are attributed to his hypostasis, his person. His human actions that are attributed to his humanity ultimately are attributed to him rather than an abstract essence. The same goes for his divine actions. And so if we actually go through Cyril's writings, we can see that he very clearly teaches the two natures. And the topic of St. Cyril is almost endlessly debated of, what did he mean? What does this mean? What translation? Is that authentic? And it can be overwhelming.
So now for for Cyril. I've already gone into a little bit of the background, so I don't want to keep anything vague. And I won't refute all of these quote mines and all of these things that Kyle keeps flashing up on screen, since Egan already did this in his video on Cyril, specifically going through all of these. However, as a beginner's look at Cyril, let's go through letter 39 and the second letter to Nestorian that Chalcedon canonized because they thought Cyril said two natures in them. And spoiler, they didn't. So letter 39, if we combine it with the context of letter 44, we understand these are not Saint Cyril's words. These are actually Paul of Emesa, and Cyril himself describes this. And if you continue through Cyril's letters and line of thinking, for Saint Acacius, who anathematizes those who say two natures after the union, Cyril himself, he applauds him, which doesn't really make sense. If he agreed with two natures, he would be condemning himself. Even Saint Cyril in letter 40, he talks about how people would react to some of his letters and try to smuggle in this idea of two natures after the union, or diophysitism as it's sometimes called, and condemn it. So let's move on to the second letter to Nestorius. Saint Cyril says just because we look at a difference between two things of humanity and divinity, that is not enough to make Christ into two natures. And he rejects this, that this would entail a separation that we reject. He continues and says that this difference is caused by a union of hypostasis. So again, from two, coming into union, of which now Christ is one. And let's even wrap this up. He had a quote of second letter to Sixensa. And after reading this, this is honestly, if you read nothing else but these two letters, this absolutely destroys everything but Miaphysitism in Cyril. Because in them, St. Cyril very clearly states that he's responding to someone who's asking, what do we do? All of these people think you're talking about two natures. They talk about, oh, well, we're talking about two natures united in this sort of union, like one person and stuff like this. What do we do? St. Cyril says they want to show that Christ is two natures, and then they say, oh, it's two natures, but united. He's still two, but he's united. And then he goes so far as to say, how can we say this? Because after the union, there is only one nature of the Son. And again, these are Cyril's own words. I'm not making these up. Now, even though the Chalcedonian Saint Leo the Great, who kicked all of the schism off, is even clearer in his declaration or Leo's tome on how the two natures are two individuals after the union, some Chalcedonians will say, Cyril, these two natures are only in thought or in theoria. But somehow will say, okay, but still after the union, Christ still has two natures. But yeah, this is what Saint Cyril said, trust. So if you actually read Saint Cyril, he speaks of this in theoria or in thought alone as a contemplation of how the natures have come into the union of the one nature of Christ. The division in thought or in theoria is only by an act in the mind through which we consider the difference of the natures in reality. But after the union, after Christ has become one in all manner of speaking, the natures, Christ, God himself, are now one inseparable unity. Again, in the words of Saint Cyril, after the point of union, or when Christ has incarnated in Saint Mary's womb, we speak no more of two, even if we say undivided or not separable, but still say two natures, we fall into the same condemnation as Nestorius, just as St. Cyril says, which results in a direct condemnation of the definition of Chalcedon, which Kyle is so eagerly trying to make us accept.
But we can see that the people that the Orientals rely on is who they say is Saint Severus. He's not actually a saint, and a lot of his theology, he's like the basis of Oriental theology, but he actually makes a Nestorian argument. So Severus is wrong, and Severus also tries to rely on St. John Chrysostom, but St. John clearly taught the two natures.
Now, he says Severus is Nestorian, but doesn't even quote Severus, or even look at a real quote, and puts up a scholar speaking about Severus. So there's nothing here to respond to by their standard, as I don't think he's actually ever read Severus. In fact, I don't even think Urhan himself has read Severus, or Philipponus as well, for that matter, as Severus himself does not deny immanent universals and affirm that universals exist in their particulars, and the work that Philipponus that David cites is not even tritheist, as St. Gregory says the same thing, that the nature is common to all three individual persons. Now, before this St. John quote that Kyle's going to mention to try to convince you is Theophysitic, essentially what is trying to be done here is to twist Philippians 2:7, but have made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men, into saying that instead of God coming in the likeness of man, God took the form or essence, generality of man. As according to Urhan, who says, form of likeness equals likeness of man, and adds it into the St. John quote. But the actual quote says, not as the form of a servant, nor in the likeness of the form of the servant, nor in the fashion of the form of the servant, but he took the form of a servant, saying that the two are completely different. And how do we seal the fact that likeness isn't equatable to form? Take a look at Romans 8:3, which says that the Son came in the likeness of sinful flesh. And if we take the idea that form equals likeness one-to-one, we would have to say that Christ literally has sinful flesh. So again, this is a conflation, and these terms in the Bible themselves are completely different.
They arose via schismatic consecrations of bishops, which don't follow the canon law, which is very important. We have the ecumenical councils. It sets the law of the church.
Well, let me just cite Canon 19 of the Council of Antioch, which states, only a council held in the presence of the metropolitan bishop may ordain a bishop. Furthermore, it is best to do this when all the brothers in the ministry of the province gather together with the metropolitan bishop. It is imperative that a majority either be present or take part in the election by letter. In this way, the decision will be made by the consent of the majority. If anything takes place contrary to these decrees, such action is hereby nullified. And so this is cut and dry. For the Oriental Orthodox, all their holy orders originate ultimately from Jacob Bardai. One bishop with two bishops of Jacob Bardai. So there's only one valid bishop. You need three in the canons. Consecrated a new bishop, a patriarch of Alexandria, and then they went and consecrated another 69 bishops to make 70. So literally made a synod out of thin air.
Right.
And that's where the modern Coptic Orthodox Church comes from, which we discovered black and white is not canonical. All those bishops are void. They're not canonically bishops.
In trying to say that our canonizations aren't valid, our good friend Craig here has been on a recent victory run slandering us, which I plan to debunk soon with Lines Den and Apostolic Orthodoxy. But as a taste, my dear viewers, what our favorite lay scholar fails to realize is that first, canons are not meant to always be taken literally at all times. If this is so, then in times where the church was endangered, we would find ourselves at a loss, since we would literally have to follow the canon to a T. Furthermore, by this weird literal standard, Craig's own church would be in violation, since during the 20th century, Soviet persecution, when the catacomb church bypassed Apostolic Canon 1, which requires at least 2 or 3 bishops for consecration, by allowing single bishops to ordain successors in secret to prevent the total extinction of the hierarchy. Regardless, Canon 4 of Nicaea clarifies on the law further, saying that in tough circumstances, you would only require a few bishops. And even St. Jacob was approved to do what he did by Theodosius and was asked by the queen to ordain bishops across the land, restoring the bishops that were killed or chased off by the Chalcedonians.
Leave the Oriental communion is because they see that their church is not universal. And that's a mark of the church, is that the church is one, holy, Catholic, which means universal and apostolic. There is very little cross-veneration of saints within their communion. For example, you're not going to see Armenian saints in the Ethiopian church, versus in the Orthodox church, Eastern Orthodoxy, you see Greek saints venerated in Russia, venerated in America, American saints venerated in Russia, in these different countries. Is that a lot of people think universal means global. Orthodoxy also is more global than the Oriental communion. The Oriental communion is not truly universal, is that they're very isolated even in their own communion, very little cross-veneration of saints.
So yeah, now it's time for even less serious arguments. First of all, I address all of these in my recent stream, but to show how crazy this is, he made this up. We aren't universal. We have Coptic, Syriac, Armenian, all of the marks mentioned in Isaiah 19, all working together and all with different peoples from all types of cultures, their own types of liturgies, while maintaining the same Orthodox faith. While if you enter any Chalcedonian church, it is uniform, the exact same. There is no difference and there is no culture, which is not like the early church at all. It's the same imperial liturgy, the same rites. In fact, before the Chalcedonian massacres that they had to do, because they were right, guys, trust, they were right. We reached far beyond what the Chalcedonians even claimed to be. And I think this is lie number 10. I guess I haven't been keeping track, but we have multiple instances of venerating each other's patriarchs in the liturgy, each other's saints across the ages, and even crossovers of communion in our churches confirmed by letters that we would constantly send to each other, like Armenians with St. Dioscorus, or how St. Severus was universally recognized by every Orthodox church, and many, many more examples. And I think his third point is ridiculous, asserting that we are too isolated. I can give you stats that show that our laity are growing in spades, and it's not faces, real people who are going to church and staying there. So I'm not sure who he's talking to who's leaving. What the? All right, since we are really reaching now, I will just speed run all of these. Okay, so EED, or essence energy distinction. According to your popular apologists, you believe in an ontological real distinction between God's essence and his energies, which would make them into two separable things, whether it be two wholes, a part in a whole, or a part in a part. Regardless, it leads to polytheism, and we hold to God as one, without any parts or others in him. So yes, we would disagree. Okay, theosis. Yes, we disagree with your version of theosis, because it is simply apotheosis, or becoming God himself. The issue is not theosis, but what is being smuggled in there. If by theosis one means that man participates in God and becomes holy, illuminated, adopted, and conformed to the image of God, then we affirm it. But if by theosis one means that man becomes uncreated by grace, unoriginate, omnipresent, omniscient, or everything God is except essence, then this is no longer the patristic idea of theosis or deification, but apotheosis with a special qualification or a special word attached. By grace does not not make contradictions orthodox or okay, nor does it turn the participation into possession of things that cannot be. A creature remains a creature even when it's glorified. This error follows naturally from a Nestorian account of the incarnation. If Christ's humanity is treated as a second countable thing, a second countable human reality with the Word, whose deification is received while being distinct from the Word's own individual identity, then the difference between Christ's flesh and the saints only becomes a difference of degree. What's the difference between how Christ was deified and the saints? They can't answer. And it can even raise the saints themselves into apotheosis or becoming God themselves. But let's just say by grace. Iconography. Yes, we have a different tradition in iconography. Yes, we do not force our laity to bow down to every icon they pass by. But that's a story for another time. Leavened bread. The leavened bread point is big for them, since Eastern Orthodox have developed to this point to only use leavened bread since they're split with Roman Catholics, and even condemn the Armenians for using such, which would be fine if their pillar, Pope Leo, and even St. Gregory didn't say otherwise. Circumcision. I assume with circumcision, he means to call us Judaizers who still keep the law, which I'm sure you've guessed by this point is a lie. The Ethiopian church has multiple saints who literally say that circumcision in the rite is purely cultural, as does the Coptic Church. Cousin marriage. By this point, I just want to thank Kyle for truly affirming me in my faith by using this as a point to dunk on the Copts in a video that is meant to be a so-called theological introduction to your religion. First, our patriarch himself has come out to condemn cousin marriage, showing how it has never been a theological part of our culture or tradition. And furthermore, we even have medieval 13th century canons that do the same. You could even find cases of cousin marriage in Chalcedonian churches as well, however widely spread out. But again, that's not the issue here.
People, in the Oriental church don't even know what their church teaches.
Yeah, so this is an interesting point to say the least. He tries to portray us as a bunch of wandering nomadic groups that don't have followers but are somehow aware of their teaching, which is another lie, in fact, since every liturgical rite in Apostolic Orthodoxy proclaims it during liturgy and condemns Chalcedon. Not to mention that we are still waiting on those people he keeps claiming are fleeing the Orthodox Church for Chalcedonian churches.
Recently, there was a debate on this issue. This Oriental person also debated Sig. Sig did an amazing job in that debate. I think that David in this debate really clearly defined the Chalcedonian position and how that's the only way to make sense from the Bible and church fathers and in philosophy. And the Oriental person didn't really understand this. And there was lots of really good comments pointing out the problems with the Oriental person's position, that ultimately the person was putting his Christology before he tried to...
Okay, here we come to the real issue. Forgive me, brothers, but it just seems like damage control over the recent debate. For example, he says in a recent debate, his Eastern Orthodox representative, David Hahn, does very well, but immediately shifts to talk about Sig, another one. Regardless, let's go over this issue of the Oriental Orthodox representative being too mean. I'd like to remind you all that their apologetics is all rhetoric. In fact, we are doing a bit of double standard, critiquing Agin when the face of EO apologetics does this against his opponents.
Did I make up Baptists now? The Baptists are made up, idiot. Okay, how are they made up? Where were they the first 1400 years? Again, where were they in the first 1400?
I'm not here to defend or pearl clutch, but there are just a few things on my mind after watching the entire debate, which I'm sure many of those who speak on the subject have not, rooting like it's a football game. First, tell me how Ian could not laugh when his opponent conceded the prompt and said that two natures aren't needed. Second, and this is something Kyle clipped as a victory, but Erhan would consistently refuse to hold to any positions and condemned his own saints, saying that they contradicted each other and denied holding to the acts or details of Ephesus, which his own saints would condemn him for. Third, conceded to the Trinity being the same as Arius, saying that only the Father is inherently God and the two other persons of the Trinity are basically only participating in the divinity. Fourth, the quote mining. Quote mining, quote mining, quote mining. If you have been watching, Kyle's entire video has just been shotgunning quotes within a few seconds to see what sticks. Now, before I drag on further, because I could keep going on about the ridiculousness of what has been happening recently, I want to leave you all off with a few things. First, this video is not meant to be a polemic tool. God forgive me if it is. For we shouldn't be wasting our time on debates. And if we do, it should be for Christ. Otherwise, it is just an ego fest and will never end. You should both strengthen your spiritual life with God while keeping a strong theological foundation so that you may defend the faith only when asked about it or approached by it, approached for it. But finally, I want to issue that if Kyle is so intent on this slander, feel free. I'm open to discussing or debating you anytime, brother, since you seem to be so confident advertising criticizing these so-called objections. I do want to concede that Kyle, however, did get one thing right. Go to church, stop debating and creating channels as catechumens are who are babies in the faith, because theology is not meant for everyone, and we have clearly seen that here. I recommend using orthodoxynearme.com and making the actual effort to go to church. And as always, pray for me.